Hey everyone, welcome to So What Do You Do Now? The show where we take perspective from other people and try to help someone else out who may be going through a similar situation. And I'm here with my cellmate.
Hilarious.
I'm here with my cellmate, my soulmate, my wife, the mother of my 3 children, of our 3 children.
Thank you for clarifying.
When you found out the particular topic that we're talking about, what sort of hurdles you've had, or we've had, and what sort of advice, if we could go back in time and give advice to ourselves or someone else who may be going through something similar. So here's our situation. Maureen and I met, we fell in love, and we got pregnant. And as we're preparing for our wedding...
Yes, in that order.
We were
old, though, so it wasn't like we were 18.
Right.
The universe was telling us something.
So as we're preparing for our wedding on Saturday, January 30th, we went to the doctor to check on how our little baby was doing. And the doctor said, hey, I think you might have a problem.
Well, he didn't say it like that.
So tell me what the doctor said.
That's because we were so lucky. Our doctor was so wonderful about making sure that as he raised concerns that we were having a child with Down syndrome, he wasn't morose about it. He was just respectful, and he wanted to prepare us, and I feel like he prepared us really, really well.
So Dr. Shaver said he had some concerns. And for me, myself, I was like, okay, this guy's older. This isn't his first rodeo. He's delivered a few kids before us.
I remember how much time he would spend with the ultrasounds. I just remember laying there quietly and thinking something has to be wrong that he's spending this much time. But then realizing with our other children that no, he's just a great doctor and he spends that much time with everybody. But at the time, we didn't know that. Charlie was our first.
So he suggested we do the amniocentesis.
Yeah, he offered it as an option. I think we had 2 options, and I don't remember what the other thing was, but the amnio was the procedure that if you did it, you'd get a more, you get confirmation if there was any genetic condition or any reason to be concerned. Yeah, he knew, and we knew. At that point, we knew. So we didn't have a diagnosis yet, but we were pretty sure. And yeah, that was 3 days before our wedding. I thought our wedding was going to be ruined because we were just going to be so upset. Or no, it was I'm totally messing up this story. It was 3 days before our wedding when we got the diagnosis.
So on Tuesday of that week, that's when Dr. Shaver said, hey, I have some concerns. Let's do a test. And we decided to do the test that day. He did the amnio and said that the results would come back on Thursday. So you and I left. I think we cried in the parking lot.
I remember the first time that he said the words Down syndrome, I think we both started to get choked up. And I remember saying something to you like, no, we can't do this at the same time.
Yeah.
Like only one of us can lose it at a time.
So I lost it and you held it together.
No, I think it was the opposite. I think you held it together, and you held it together for all those subsequent visits, which was great because I was a mess. I look back and it was a lack of education and knowledge about what Down syndrome really meant today. I'd grown up knowing a couple people with Down syndrome, but it had never been a major part of my life. And I was also more focused, as silly as this sounds, I was more focused on feeling an overwhelming sense of guilt that I had done something to cause my baby to not be perfectly healthy or perfect or whatever, and the opposite of what you imagine in your mind. The first time you find out you're having a baby, you just imagine all these typical things, proms, graduations, weddings, and then atypical things, like they're going to be the next president of the United States, God help us. All these phenomenal things, which how many typical kids go there anyway, but you just don't imagine the worst. Nobody finds out they're having a baby and thinks, oh, I hope he doesn't spend a lot of time in prison, or at least I didn't.
Okay, so we left.
We had the amnio done.
You went back to work.
Yeah.
I went to work. As I remember it, you didn't want to talk to anyone. You were like, you didn't even want to know anything until the results came back. And I went to work and I Googled Down syndrome groups Charlotte, and they had the dads meeting. And I found the link to it, and it was that night. So I sent it to you and I said, do you want to go? And you said, no. no, I don't want to go. We don't have the results back yet.
And also, it's a dad's group.
Right.
Because I thought, what are you going to say to this group of guys? Hey, guys, how are you? How are your children with Down syndrome? We might have one, but we might not.
I went in and I sat down, and it was about an hour into it, and I heard the guys going around the room talking about their kids having heart surgery or this or that or whatever. Mm-hmm. And about an hour into it, that's when Tony looked at me and was like, "Hey, new guy, what's your story?" And then I just kind of broke down to a group of strangers. And they were great. And they were like, "Hey, man, congratulations. It's going to be okay. You're having a boy. That's awesome."
Yeah, I refused to break down to anybody except for the day that I got the diagnosis.
How did that go?
So that was a disaster. We had a genetic counselor. This genetic counselor was very young. I suspect very inexperienced, as comes with youth. And when we sat in her office...
Yeah, after we had the amnio, we went to her office for her to explain it, and she laid out the options.
Yeah.
And the doctor laid out the options, and he was very diplomatic about it as well. He was like, he said, "I've got to tell you this, but there are options." He's like, "I just have to say that." He's like, "I don't think it would make a difference to you guys."
I remember, so for me, the only doctor who actually said it, and you weren't there, it was just a regular OB appointment, and he was so uncomfortable, but he was the one who said, "Listen, I have to say this, but you only have until, 20 weeks to terminate." And for the record, I'm pro-choice, but it was never going to be an option for us. We knew that. And I just remember putting up my hand and saying, "Nope, we're good. Like, you don't even have to go down that path. Termination is not an option," which it just wasn't. But I remember just thinking like, oh God, like, don't even talk to me about that. So how I got the diagnosis was the genetic counselor left me a voicemail. I was at work, and her voicemail went something like this: "Hi, Maureen. I have some news." I was like,
"Please call me."
Like, gee, I wonder what her news is.
Put yourself in her shoes. Did she leave you a peppy message? "Hey, call me," or is it just sort of flat? What would be the best way to go about it?
I think you have to set the tone from the beginning. My advice is the same as the way that when someone now tells me that they know somebody who is expecting a child with Down syndrome, I'm very cognizant of the fact that I immediately say, "Oh my gosh, congratulations, they're expecting a baby." It's all in the approach from the beginning. So she was always like that, and she should have, in my mind, if I were leaving a message for someone, it would be in the exact same, "Hi, Maureen, this is so and so, give me a call when you get a chance." No tell. And she had a significant tell. And it went like this: "Hi, Maureen, give me a call when you get a chance. I have some news." It was just like Eeyore.
Yeah.
Anyway, so I knew what the news was, and I already knew anyway. Although back then my theory was that because we had met so quickly and everything had just felt so perfect and come together so perfectly, and we were engaged and we were getting married, and friends bought my wedding gown, and everything was just falling into place, and I just kept thinking something will be wrong with this baby because everything else is so perfect. And I was so scared that some sort of karma, it was my fault for doing something. But anyway, so she left a message, and I knew what it was. I was at work, and I went in the empty office and shut the door and called her back, and I don't even remember what she said. I remember bringing in like paper and a pen like I was going to take notes, but really there was nothing I needed to write down. There was no way to end the conversation. She told me, and I said, "Okay, thank you." I hung up the phone, and I just sat there, and I really remember the lights in the office had not gone on, and so I was sitting in the dark, and I texted or pinged a colleague because I knew she had a box of tissues at her desk, and I said, "Hey, I'm in so-and-so's office. Will you bring the tissues in?" And she came in with the tissues, and I just said, got the call from the genetic counselor, and the baby has Down syndrome. And she was so awesome. She just gave me such a big hug. I remember the first thing I said was like, I have no patience. I just kept thinking, like, I'm going to have this child who's going to require an exorbitant amount of patience, and I don't have any patience. And now, as we've come to find out, I do, in fact, have no patience. We now have 3 children, and all 3 have suffered from my lack of patience. But that was the big thing that was all I could think about. And she just hugged me. And years later, she said, I was so worried that I had said the wrong thing. And I said, it was Abby. I said two things. One, I don't really remember what you said, so you could have said anything at that point. But no, you did exactly. You just gave me a hug, and you said it was going to be okay. I knew I wasn't going to call you and tell you at work.
I know.
Awful genetic counselor. No, I now I know you knew, but I thought that you didn't. I thought you were waiting for the result. Yeah, so I remember you came home and we were sitting on the couch because I had waited like hours. It was like killing me. I think I called my mom. I think I called my parents. Oh, you know what? I remember what my brother said. No one will have more people loving him than Charlie. But my mom said when she got off the phone, she cried. I think that it's okay. I struggle with the people who say, oh, I wasn't sad. I think in today's day and age, unless you've had real experience with someone with Down syndrome, I think it is entirely human to feel sadness at hearing the diagnosis. And it's not because you're sad that you're having a child with Down syndrome. It's because you immediately know that child is going to have so many challenges ahead of him or her. And as a parent, all you want is to make life as easy for your kids as possible. Of
course, you want your kids to have every opportunity and less challenges. Right. And when you know you're going to have a child that's going to have challenges, it's a lot. The thing about it for me, though, is that, and this pisses me off, getting the diagnosis is immediate worry. I thought all the worst things. I thought this was me being punished for whatever bad choices I'd made in my life. And I'd done something, and now this child was going to suffer because of me. So I felt a lot of guilt. And I've written about this. I've written about all of this. I've written too much. At the time, it was catharsis for me, but now I look back and worry about Emma reading it, Liam reading it, and not fully understanding. They'll be busy watching TV. They're not going to read anything. TV won't exist. It'll just be a hologram. You were saying that you had some of the guilt and the what did you do wrong and all that sort of stuff. And I had the same stuff. I was worried that there was some karma coming back for all the off-color jokes I had made. Yeah. The kids that you may not have paid attention to or made fun of. Part of me still feels that. Yeah, I totally agree. I remember when I was little, my brother and I calling each other the R word, and I remember my mom getting so upset and saying, don't use that word, and not understanding. And that was just the vernacular at the time, which breaks my heart. Anyone who hasn't had that experience, you think the worst. Part of me wishes we didn't have the diagnosis, although then I feel like it would have affected the birth part so much. It would have taken away from that time. But all the time I spent worrying, and I mean, for me, my pregnancy memories go immediately to being at work all day and just trying to focus and not think about it, and having a colleague who, bless her heart, always had some story about, oh, how wonderful this whatever, some child with disabilities or whatever. And like, no disrespect to any other family, but I did not want to hear anybody else's story. I didn't want to see, remember we had that book, Babies with Down Syndrome or whatever, like how to have a baby with Down Syndrome 101 or whatever. I couldn't leave it cover up on the coffee table. I had to cover it up because they had this adorable little baby, but he so clearly had Down syndrome, and I just couldn't even look at him because I just felt like I felt so guilty, and I just felt like it was my fault, and I didn't want to talk about it with anybody because I felt like that was surely what other people were thinking. Like, oh, well, what did she do? What did she do wrong? And we weren't planning to have a baby, so I wasn't taking prenatal vitamins. I was racked with guilt about my body not being prepared. Like, what did I do? How did I cause this? Now, of course, we know that there wasn't anything I could have done or whatever. What was it that changed that made you want to go? We went to that dinner with the Kiefers and the Shorts. Yeah, I think you just wore me down. Honestly. I don't know. The universe works in mysterious ways. We had gone through so much. I think one of the minor blessings for us was that
Charlie did develop high drops. And so there was that possibility that he wasn't going to survive the pregnancy.
Explain what high drops is for somebody
High
who
drops
doesn't know.
is, and I believe I'm correct here, is it 2 or more places with fluid?
Oh, so it's not just the lungs?
No, because he had fluid like in his heart, I think.
I thought he just had it in his chest.
It was in like 3 different places. And so they would continue to monitor it. And remember, it resolved. We were so worried because we'd gone through the trauma or whatever, the process of finding out that Charlie had Down syndrome, and then had our wedding. And it was like the week after the wedding, we went back in and the doctor was like, okay, we've got another issue here. He explained high drops. And I mean, I stayed off the internet. I did not go on the internet.
That's good advice for somebody.
Yes, it's
avoid the Google.
Goodness, yes. It's like when you think about advocacy campaigns and people going to a city council meeting to protest something, and you think, oh my gosh, the room was filled with people protesting this thing. Well, that's because 4 times as many people who are happy that the thing is happening just stayed at home because they're happy. They don't feel motivated to go say anything.
Okay, so high drops.
So high drops is potentially terminal for a fetus, a baby. And we were lucky. Charlie's resolved. And then it didn't. And then the fluid came back in his chest, in his left lung cavity.
So that was in May.
So his due date was July 17th.
So we went to the doctor like the Friday of Memorial Day weekend.
That was the first time Dr. Shaver put a needle in my belly and took the fluid out of Charlie's lung in utero. I did not watch. I actually never saw the needle.
So the Friday of Memorial Day weekend.
So it was kind of impactful for me because I remember months later taking the purse that I had with me at the time to go to the hospital and finding like the pearls and the pearl earrings and all the things that I had worn to this big work event. So it was just such a crazy time because he was 7 weeks early.
So Friday we go to the doctor and they say, you're being admitted. We're going to put a needle into Charlie to pull the fluid out of his lungs.
Yep.
So they pulled the fluid out of his lungs.
And it did not hurt.
And I watched him, and it was just amazing just to watch somebody do that. They had the sonogram so they could see where they were going, where they were sticking. And he still has a little scar under his rib cage.
Yeah.
Little like hole.
Yep.
So June 1st, Charlie's born. And I remember one of the guys I work with told me, he said, do yourself a favor and take a moment before you meet your son and say goodbye to yourself.
Jesus, that's not depressing at all. Say goodbye to your life.
No, so before you meet your son, just take a moment because your life is not about you anymore. Your life is about this child.
Well, what I would say is, hello, I was pregnant for 7 months. So your life was yours then?
Oh, honey.
Yeah.
All right. So we'll just cut around that too. So
No. I think it's important to point out that people are wrong and that pregnancy is a long time. So a couple things. One, when you finally see your baby, and we couldn't hold him right away because he had a chest tube because the fluid had returned.
Yeah.
So Charlie was in the NICU for a month while I sat there beside him. You were working because you were still freelance at the time, so you had to work. And I totally understood that. But I did not have a lot of clarity around a lot of other things because I had severe postpartum depression, which I did not know at the time. And which
How did that go? Explain that a little bit for somebody who might be.
For one thing, I think that all NICU nurses need training in identifying postpartum depression because there were multiple opportunities for nurses who could have intervened and said, hey, you need to talk to somebody. So that was a mess. But I attributed it to the fact that I had a baby in the NICU. He was a preemie. He had a chest tube. He had Down syndrome. I was a first-time mother. And so I thought, surely that's why I feel this oppressive sadness and just weight on me. And surely this is why I'm crying all the time. I don't remember crying when I held Charlie, and I held Charlie a lot. Like, if I could hold him, I was holding him. But it was more like coming home at the end of the day and just...
While he was still in the NICU.
Yep. He was still in the NICU, which, by the way, I highly recommend the NICU because you get to go home and sleep. Or you did anyway. I also tried to pump, which that was a whole disaster. That could be a whole episode. How to overcome when you have no milk production. Because your first baby, you have no clue. You have no clue what your body should or shouldn't be doing. You have no clue about a lot of things to do with your body. But I remember pumping and being so excited that I had my little bag of milk and walking in, and there was another woman walking into the NICU at the same time one morning, and she had like 3 gallons. I was like, oh my God, I'm not enough of a mother. Like, these are the things you think. Your brain just is not operating clearly. And so you think, I'm not a good enough mother. Oh, I do remember the funniest thing. I was in the privacy room in the NICU pumping, and the smoke detector or the fire alarm went off. And I remember like sitting there, and I can't see me, people, but I have my hands over my chest because when you're pumping, you've got these strange cones, and sitting there and in this cold room shivering, and the fire alarm goes off, and I'm like, oh man, fire alarm. And I'm like, oh, I have a baby. Like, I need to get out of here and get my baby. There's a fire alarm going off. I've never gotten dressed so fast in my life. And like, part of me was like, do I just run out? Which I'm sure would have been awesome. Meanwhile, when I finally did make it out, they were like, oh no, it's fine. Don't worry about it. I'm like, there's a fire alarm and I have a baby in this NICU. I feel like we should be moving or doing something. Like, no, you're fine, lady. Go back in with your cones.
So a month later, Charlie comes home.
Yep.
With a heart monitor.
Oh, God. Yes, that thing. Those heart monitors. Remember, they would spit out the data reports and be like, oh, there were no signs of any incidents this month. And meanwhile, the thing would wake us up at 3 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah.
Remember the screeching?
Yeah.
Oh, my God.
That thing was awful.
And that's it's a heart monitor with an alarm that could resuscitate any heartbeat. And then remember when it broke?
Yeah.
And so it's going off, and I had to call the company, and they were like, what you need to do is get a screwdriver. And I was like, what you need to do? That was awful. But that was another element to the postpartum, because Charlie and I were tethered to this heart monitor. And so we were either in our bedroom or in the living room. And there's, a 20-foot span between those 2 places, and that's where we were for a month before he was off the heart monitor. And remember, we both said, all right, we're done with the heart monitor, he's fine, which we did not recommend. Please talk with your doctor.
Yeah. Please consult. I'd like to qualify that neither of us are medical professionals. We're just giving a perspective on what we went through.
Parents trying to figure it out.
Honestly, as I talk to other parents, or you meet other dads or other moms, and you talk to folks, it is a lot of just figuring it out as you go. Mm-hmm. You want to know that it's going to be okay. And I think that's the thing that the dads made me realize, was that you're going to get through this. It's going to be fine. Are you
going to get through it? Of course. You need one foot in front of the other. Right?
Right.
I mean, I don't think we're doing anyone a service by sugarcoating.
No.
Would I change anything? No. But it is a constant roller coaster. You hear people say, oh, little kids, little problems, big kids, big problems. With a child with Down syndrome, it's just different types of challenges. And the positives far outweigh the negatives. He's the sweetest boy, and he's so loving, and he's so funny. He loves making people laugh. Like last night with Tabitha, he was just so like, yeah. When he hits a button and he realizes he can make somebody laugh with it, he will hit that button all day long. So I wouldn't change a thing. And I've gone back and forth on, oh, well, if we could take Down syndrome away. You want to say, my child is not defined by Down syndrome. But by the same token, Down syndrome is also such a big part of him. It's a part of who he is. And he has no fear, for better or worse. He has no filter, for better or worse. There are all these things that an extra chromosome rejiggers a little bit, but it makes him who he is. And he wouldn't be Charlie if he didn't have Down syndrome.
You wrote that article that you caught a lot of flack for, about if I could take the Down syndrome away.
Yeah, back then when I wrote that article, and it's interesting if you go back and read, which I haven't, but I remember enough. You read the span of the articles. I started writing about Charlie and parenting a child with Down syndrome, or a child with a disability, when he was 18 months, because we had just had Emma, and I was going back to work as in the job share. He wasn't even walking yet. we just had Emma, and it's very easy to compare your children, even though you're not supposed to, because when you have a child with Down syndrome, that infancy stage just lasts so much longer. And then Emma was like, bam, just hitting milestones left and right. And you think, oh my gosh, we have a little protege. No, she's just a typically developing kid. Anyway, when you have a typically developing child, after you've had a child with Down syndrome or any kind of delay, you marvel at how quickly this child can do things. And really, that's just typical.
Yeah, I wonder what it would be like if Charlie was our second child, how that would have been. And I'm sure, I mean, obviously there's other parents who have gone through that and have had typical children and then had a child with special needs. So
I think it would have been harder because we would have understood better what we were facing or what we were seeing. I think it would have been harder. Ignorance is bliss, you know? We watched Charlie do Charlie. And I was like, I do remember, though, worrying about, oh, my gosh, is he ever going to roll over? Oh, my gosh, is he ever going to be able to sit up by himself? Oh, my gosh, is he ever going to be able to walk? And my advice to parents of a baby with Down syndrome is to just forget all that because it is going to happen and you're going to waste time worrying about it. I would also say you have to choose the path that's right for you and your child. But I feel like I tried to compensate for my own guilt by cramming in therapy. And meanwhile, like, just enjoy your baby.
Yeah.
Just enjoy your baby and watch him or her, you know, just be happy and don't beat yourself up racing from one therapy appointment to the other. Or I remember going into work late because I'd schedule therapies at the house in the morning, and then I get to work late and I'd feel guilty about getting to work late, but then I felt guilty about leaving Charlie after the therapy. It's just constant guilt, but that's also parenthood. So
Charlie's born. He's grown up.
Oh, you started to talk about the article where I got a lot of flack because I said I would take away his Down syndrome. I guess my point is, at that moment in time, yes, I would have. And the thing for me, and I'm speaking only for myself. Hello, I'm only speaking for myself, America. Everything I've written, I've always written authentically. That's exactly how I truly felt at the time. But know that your feelings will change. My feelings changed. And as you overcome one hurdle, or you just get to know your child better, and you get to know the world that he or she is facing better. Once Charlie started at school, that was an entirely different education, because then we found ourselves having to educate the teachers and pushing for inclusion and not realizing it's not inclusion that works, it's effective inclusion. And what does effective inclusion mean?
Well, and then you're battling with the school system and their resources and what they
lack of funding and
what they'll own up to.
Lack of training and lack of knowledge, lack of experience.
Yeah. You have the system, I'm doing the little quote things with my fingers where they're just, you know, oh, he's not able to do this because he doesn't have this score, and we can't do this for this because the data doesn't show that. And the reality was that they just didn't have the resources. Yeah. So instead of just saying, hey, we don't have the resources, we'll give you what we have, it was like we were banging our heads against something that we were told was the issue based on the data.
I think we could do a whole podcast about education in a child with Down syndrome.
Yeah, well, let's make this one just be about having a kid and don't even talk about the school system stuff.
Yeah, because I mean, there are a lot of good pieces of advice we could give for pre-K. So for me, I guess what we really didn't talk about in the beginning is that when we got the diagnosis, you dived in and you wanted to know as much as possible. And I would come home at the end of every day and climb in bed and just put the covers over my head, figuratively and literally. I would put up such a front at work because I didn't want anyone to see. I felt guilty about feeling devastated. I felt guilty about the diagnosis because it was my fault. I was just consumed by guilt. I was consumed by worry. He's not going to have any friends. He's not going to be able to walk. He's all these different things.
All the stuff that just in hindsight just seems crazy.
Yeah. But I worked so hard at staying upbeat and, you know, oh, everything will be great. Everything's going to be fine all day long. And there's a walkway at work between the door and the parking deck. And I would get to the walkway and I'd have held it together all day long. And then I'd start walking across the walkway to the parking deck. And by the time I got to the end, I would just be that kind of cry where you can't even catch your breath. And I'd get in the car and I'd just pray I wasn't going to run into somebody. And I'd get in the car and I'd just sob and I'd pull it together and drive home, and you were working, and so you weren't home, and I'd just be at home by myself in the dark. Like, I'd just sit and just worry. And we hadn't known each other long enough to know how to communicate very well. And I remember, and I've written about this, these are the things that stuck out to me. You would, of course, as you do, fall asleep in 2 seconds every single night.
Sorry, I fell asleep there. I didn't hear what you said.
Oh, hilarious. But you would fall asleep, and I would go in the bathroom and cry. And I remember sitting on the cold tile and just holding my belly and just apologizing to Charlie because it had to have been my fault. It was my fault, and I was so sorry. And I would like bargain, like everybody does at one point or another. You bargain with God. But anyway, lots of wasted time. My advice, if you have a prenatal diagnosis, is to try and put a lot of your worries on hold until you can actually hold that baby. Because holding Charlie and loving him and snuggling with him, and oh my gosh, their morning naps together, and that was such a special time. And so in that regard, I'm thankful that we had the prenatal diagnosis, because then I already knew it. So we had this baby, and I could enjoy him.
I'm a devil's advocate here for a second, but do you think the prenatal diagnosis added to that worry and that concern?
Oh, absolutely. You mean before he was born?
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. Because otherwise, when you're pregnant, you're like, you got no clue.
Well,
sure.
But we've talked about this before, where it's like, if we didn't get the prenatal diagnosis, what would it? We had plenty of time during the pregnancy to prepare for it. But do you think that if we had found out, like if we had thought we were having a typical child, and then he's born, and they go, oh, hey, by the way.
I think that would have been an enormous strain, because it's hard to know, and everyone's different. But because remember, I got hit with so much postpartum depression that I feel like if I had also just gotten the diagnosis, I don't know how I would have been able to deal with it.
Well, I mean, it's all relative, too. I mean, we went through what we went through. As you talk to other people who got a diagnosis the day they were born, the baby was born.
Right. Or a month later.
Yeah.
Or 3 months later. It's crazy to me.
I mean, we went through what we went through, and I don't think, we can't go back and change it.
Right.
So.
Although, notably, so remember, we got pregnant with Emma so quickly that when they offered us testing again, we did it again.
Yeah.
The damn medical industry makes so much money off of fear and a lack of education, a lack of unbiased, accurate, updated information. And for that, you should visit lettercase.org. Stephanie Meredith wrote that literature that all the major Down syndrome associations signed off on in the beginning, and then they all got freaked out because in order for a physician to feel comfortable sharing literature, it has to be unbiased. And unbiased means acknowledging that there are options, and termination is one of them.
Part of what I've been hearing from other folks when I've been doing this is that a lot of the information that you get is all statistics.
I think it has to be balanced. You don't censor the information, but balance it, because I think too many organizations want to sugarcoat and talk about how everything will be great. It's amazing. It's not amazing all the time. There are moments of amazing, and there are moments of pure crap, which is also parenthood. That's any child. Yep, all 3 of our kids. Lord knows, Liam, bless his heart, the first 7 months of his life were very difficult.
So what do you say? You let's say a good friend of yours says to you, oh my gosh.
So what do you do now? For me, for someone who has a diagnosis, it's stay off the internet, and it's get connected to families, but on your own time. Everybody's got to do stuff on their own time. And so when we went to dinner the night before I was admitted to the hospital, which we didn't know I was about to be admitted to the hospital to have Charlie, the night before we went to dinner with 2 other couples, each of whom has a child with Down syndrome. And oh my gosh, I just remember the crying that went on at that table that night, but it was a cathartic cry in many ways, because it was the first time I could actually share my concerns with somebody who knew exactly what I was talking about. In that regard, the support groups, the parenting groups on Facebook, those kinds of things, like you've gotta taper your use of them. Sometimes you get in and you've got people who are just unfiltered and only share the bad and the negative or the scary, and that's not what life is all about. Parenting a child with Down syndrome has been the most life-changing event, and obviously an ongoing event. But in so many ways, Charlie has given me purpose I was always a writer, but have often said I didn't have anything to write about, and the worries and the concerns, but then also the desire to learn. Once that clicked in, I did want to learn as much as possible to help him as much as possible. And then that's the irony, that by shutting down, when I finally clicked it on, I was like, oh crap, I was feeling guilty again because I wasn't prepared. I could have been more prepared. I could have spent all that time studying or whatever. Not that you can study what it's like to have a child with Down syndrome, but then I felt unprepared.
But you can hear from other people, and I think that's the purpose of this, is to really just sit down and let other folks know that, there is light at the end of the tunnel. They're just like any other kid in a lot of respects.
Knowing other families, I feel, is so beneficial. I want Charlie to have peers, but it's also so wonderful for Emma and Liam to be friends with other families who have a child with Down syndrome, and be friends with the siblings and have that support system as they get older. So that's important to me, and I want to do better at it.
Earlier today, when we went to the meet and greet for camp, it was so funny watching them play with all the other kids.
Yeah.
Because there were
everybody.
Everybody.
Yeah.
It was just everybody, and they were just all being kids together, and it was so fun to watch them. And I'm so excited for Charlie to go to camp in a few years. And
I can't believe it. 2 more years.
Yeah.
No, time is flying, and it goes by fast, and you just need to find the enjoyment in it, not worry so much. That's my biggest advice. Don't worry so much. I wasted so much time in my pregnancy worrying about things that I remember I had read something about a child with Down syndrome and the hip bone, and like, don't carry your child on your hip because it'll whatever.
Google.
I hadn't even had the baby yet.
Right. And you're reading
and
something
I'm like,
on
oh my
Google.
gosh, I can't carry my baby on my head, which is...
So your words of advice are, don't worry so much, stay off the internet, and connect with other families. Is that fair?
Yeah, that is. And advocate for information. Keep pushing for accurate, updated information. Yeah, you're going to get statistics, and not all of them are great, but as much as the termination rate, that percentage is high, although it's debatable how high it is. Different organizations report different percentages, but the life expectancy of a person with Down syndrome has increased so much. So just be ready to sift through the information and know that parenting a child with Down syndrome is in so many ways like parenting a typically developing child. You just never know where those challenges are going to come, what's going to come easy, what's going to be more difficult, and making sure you have a support system. No, I'm very proud of you for doing this. I think it's important. I think everyone's going to have a different story, but I think you're also going to find many common threads.
That's what, as I'm not even just interviewing folks, but just talking to guys tonight about it, and everybody's got the same message. And I think it's different situations for different people, and there's little parameters or qualifiers for each thing. When you were diagnosed, what came out of it, what sort of medical stuff you've had to deal with. And I'll say that we've been very lucky with Charlie, that he's
blessed.
He has been healthy as a horse for the most part, knock on wood.
Yeah.
But we will come back and we'll talk about IEPs and the school system and therapy and all that sort of stuff to deal with, and we can do one on postpartum depression if you wanted to.
Yeah, sure. I'm an open book.
Thank you so much, wife. I do appreciate it. I know it means a lot to somebody else who's out there who may be going through something similar, so I'm glad you're a part of this with me. I couldn't do it without you. I really couldn't. That little boy's changed us.
He has. And I think it's important to point out that when you're saying I couldn't do this without you, you mean all 3 kids, not just Charlie.
Yeah, that's a whole other podcast. Well, on that note, thanks again, Maureen. I do appreciate it. Thank you for being on So What Do You Do Now? And if anyone out there has any other questions or anything like that, check out sowhatdoyoudonow.com. All the information's there. Thanks again. We'll talk to you soon.
Thanks, Jeremy.